Okay, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the Association of the United States Army. I'm Carter Ham, and I have the privilege of serving as the president here at the association, and I'm very, very thankful that you've taken a little time out to join us here this evening. So Colonel and Mrs. Mastriano, thank you very much for agreeing to be here this evening. A couple other distinguished guests that I'd like to introduce you to. Bishop Neil Buchan, Auxiliary Bishop of the Archdiocese for Military Services. Bishop Buchan is a retired Army chaplain, and near and dear to Christy's heart and mine, he's a fellow graduate of John Carroll University in Cleveland, Ohio. Now, if you were to go back in time and look at a photograph of the Army ROTC cohort in 1975 at John Carroll and say, which one of these cadets is going to be a bishop? You would not have picked the leather jacket, wearing, motorcycle riding, Ranger qualified, soon-to-be infantryman would not have been your first choice to end up as a bishop in the Catholic Church. But Neil, it's great to see you again. Thanks for joining us this evening. Also joining us, Lieutenant General Nadia West, the 44th Surgeon General of the United States Army, the highest-ranking female graduate from West Point, and the first African-American woman in the Army to achieve the rank of 3-star. And she's here with her best friend, Colonel Don West, the noted, no, not General Jordan, that's right. Colonel Don West, a distinguished soldier in his own right. Lieutenant General Joe DeFrancisco, civilian aide to the Secretary of the Army for the state of Virginia. General DeFrancisco, welcome. Lieutenant Generals Jordan Stevenson Stroop, and of course our very own Lieutenant General Guy Swan, Vice President for Education here at AUSA. Somewhere here is Steve Austin, Mr. Steve Austin, the Assistant Chief of the Army Reserve. Thank you, Steve, for joining us. And of course, Sergeant Major of the Army, retired Ken Preston, known to all soldiers worldwide. And we're very, very proud to have him as Vice President for NCO and soldier programs here at AUSA. A reminder, tonight's program is being recorded by C-SPAN for later broadcast. So get your well thought out, probing questions ready so that when it comes times for that, you can watch later when it's broadcast and impress your family with the insightful questions that you pose to tonight's lecture. It also means be on your best behavior, all right? I'd also a special thanks tonight to Nzinga Curry, who many of you met coming in, the director of AUSA's Institute for Land Warfare, and to Joe Craig, the director of AUSA's book program. They and the great staff here made tonight possible. How about a round of applause for all those that did all the hard work? If you were to seek a description of what it means to be a soldier scholar, you might well come across the image of tonight's guest lecturer in our continuing Lemnitzer lecture series. Colonel Douglas Mastriano has led troops in the Cold War and in combat. He's a gifted military planner, has instructed at the Army War College. He earned a PhD in history from the University of New Brunswick. Colonel Mastriano's first book, Alvin York, a new biography of the hero of the Argonne, was published in 2014. And it said that you conducted 12 years of research for the book. Rebecca probably knows to the day how many days of research he put into that book. And he has stated that his interest in Sergeant York began when he was a child, after having viewed the movie Sergeant York, the Academy Award-winning film in 1941 starring Gary Cooper. His book on Sergeant York received the 2015 William E. Colby Award from Norwich University. Most of us at AUSA know someone pretty notable from Norwich University. An award for a first published work of a military topic author. He also won the Army Historical Foundation Award, the U.S. Army War College Madigan Award, and the 2015 Crater Family Book Prize in American Values. Quite a distinguished accomplishment for a first book. His latest book comes to us at the centennial of the battle of which he writes, telling the stories of the soldiers, including the stories of the German soldiers who fought there. It's a timeless story with clear lessons for us today. Please welcome Colonel Douglas Mastriano, author of Thunder in the Argonne, a new history of America's greatest battle.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Thank you. Wow, it's an honor to be here with you tonight. Thank you for taking the time to be part of this event. I'm really humbled by all the distinguished visitors and everybody that's out here. My wife, Rebecca, is 31 years. I don't know how she did that with Doug Mastriano. You know, and she was out on many of the digs out there in the Argonne Forest helping us search for the lost Sergeant York site. And so she's all part of that story as well. And Colonel Ken Shaw, thank you for being here. Friends from Fort Stewart and Heidelberg. Roland Hennis from Rieger, thank you, brother, for coming out here. We're surprised to see a brother here working on Baltic security when I was still in active duty, and then I turn around, and the only time I've seen him before, except once, has been in Riga. And so many other great friends here. Thanks for taking the time to be here. Sue Kasner, whose father was former USER commander. I mean, it's great to be with here as well. Went to church together here in Alexandria some years ago. Thunder in the Argonne, 100 years ago, this very day and instant, that the American Army with a brigade of Marines was fighting for its life in one of the bloodiest campaigns in American history. We're talking about 20,000 casualties a week, even in the last week of the campaign. The last day, 11 November, the war ended, of course, 11 o'clock. And just in 5 hours of fighting, there was about 11,000 casualties, more than the entire 24-hour period in Normandy in 1944 on June 6th. It was just an awful epic. The Germans fought to the last, and it was a vicious struggle that changed and shaped the world that we live in today. And the message that I think that I have coming out of this book is history is changed by men and women like you and me. And oftentimes they're the people that you look at and say wouldn't make a difference in life. So never give up hope, because what you do in life does matter and echoes across the generations and into eternity. So here we go. In April 1917, the United States found itself finally in this war, and we were at war but not ready. April 1917, we had a 200,000-man army. It was pretty small, especially by those standards. It was mostly a frontier garrison army. You could see chasing insurgents in the Moros Islands and in the Philippines. My great-grandfather, you see him right there, chasing Pancho Villa in 1916. We never got him, sadly. But we're at war, but we're not ready. We don't have the aircraft. We don't have any tanks. I mean, it's not looking good for the home team. To put this in perspective for you, here's what the armies looked like in 1914. So this giant right here is Russia, 6 million men. Germany, 4 million. France, under 4 million. Austria, about 2 million. Italy, over 1 million. England, 600,000. Serbia, 240,000. United States Army right here, right after Belgium, 222,000. United States Army would be after that. And we're going into this war at a cold start. And who's going to pay the price for the lack of strategy and forethought? It won't be the senior leaders. It's going to be the soldiers. And it's a terrible price they have to pay. So we're at war, and how do we get over there quickly? 1917 is a rough year. I'll go over that in a moment. But France becomes the arsenal democracy, and then the French will provide almost all the tanks we need, almost all the aircraft, much of the equipment, and the Brits will as well. And they're doing everything they can to get us over there and fit us out rapidly before the war is lost. So it's a cold start, but we're going to have to get there quickly. One of the soldiers who's training down there at Camp Gordon, his name is Lieutenant Herbert Jones, and he really captures the moment here. And in order to get the United States ready for war rapidly, the French and British send over thousands of military advisors, combat veterans, and they come over, and here's what Lieutenant Jones says: foreign instructors arrived to show us the only way to win the war. The French swore by the hand grenade and the light machine gun. The British swore by the bayonet, and we swore and worked a little bit harder. We don't know what we're getting into here. It's a hard start. And to make matters even worse, if you're going from a 200,000-man army to over 4 million in 2 years, that's hard. The infrastructure, the skills, the education, the understanding of modern war is just not there. 20% of the United States Army are foreign-born. And most of them, like a lot of my ancestors that arrived off the boat from Italy, they can't even speak English. And it's pretty bad. So the training day starts at 5 o'clock in the morning, ends at 1900, and then after breaking for dinner, the officers come back in the evening to train all the Greeks, Italians, the Russians, on and on and on, English, so they can understand orders. That is quite a handicap. But, okay, so lots of obstacles here to getting the United States into this war rapidly. We need to be there within a year or less, otherwise it's going to be lost. But then we have a leadership problem here. Pershing is a bit controversial because the foreign combat veterans from France and England arrive, and they say, here's how you fight a modern war. And Pershing basically rejects their help and says, no, you British and French are in this mess because you don't know how to fight. The Americans were aggressive. We're going to win this with the bayonet and the rifle. And the French are like, we tried that in 1914. It's not a very good idea. We lost 250,000 men in 2 weeks. But anyway, we're going to try to do it the American way. And in frustration, the French premier, leader of France, George Clemenceau, says, well, if the Americans do not permit the French to teach them, then the Germans will do so. And that's not the way you want to learn to fight a war. That explains the high casualty rates we have the last 6 weeks of the war, about 20,000 a week. The divisions we send over pretty rapidly. It's the core of the Army. It's 4 divisions. You see them right there, the 1st, 2nd, 26th, and 42nd. They get there about 100,000 men, and then there's going to be a wait before the rest of the Army catches up because the rest of the Army is being trained. So one of those soldiers being trained, and it ships over early, actually is Rebbe's grandfather, and that's him. He signed up as soon as the United States entered the war, and he's going to be one of the first Americans over there, relatively speaking. There's a big problem. The Germans plan on launching a million-man attack in early 1918 to try to knock the French and British out of the war before the Americans could show up, and it's going to be a hard-run thing. And I'm going to show you exactly how pressed we were. There's a lot of pressure on the Americans to amalgamate. So instead of creating an American army and sending it over by divisions, is it rather send over by battalion and integrate them directly into French and British units. Yes, they could be there more rapidly. They'll be under more senior and experienced leadership, but it won't be an American army. And it'll give the United States less leverage after the war. Wilson sees this and tells General Pershing, no, do not amalgamate. And so we're going to have an independent force. This gives you an overview of the German attacks. The Germans are going to launch 5 spring attacks, the 5 spring offensives, and you can see the effect of that on the map. And it's a pretty hard-pressed thing. The German attack up north destroys an entire British army. The British Fifth Army is destroyed. American forces literally arrive and get off the boats and are backstopping to try to hold that front. It's pretty bad. And in the German attack down in the Aisne-Marne area, there's panic in Paris. The leadership flees. I mean, it's pretty close run. And that's where we have Rock-on-the-Marne. Bishop Buckham, you can tell me about that, huh? We served in Rock-on-the-Marne together. Rock-on-the-Marne and all these legends. We have the Devil Dogs and Belleau Wood. All this goes on to stop the last German attack, or one of the last German attacks, and stabilizes the front. The 5 German attacks culminate, and the first Supreme Allied commander is a Frenchman, General Foch. And General Foch was given all the powers of a Supreme Allied commander in April of 1918 because of the crisis of the German attack. And so now we have unity of command and unity of effort for the first time in 4 years on the Western Front. This is a revolution in military affairs, and this is the model for World War II and for NATO today, in fact, in many ways. So General Foch sees the German culmination before anyone else does. He summons a meeting in his headquarters outside of Paris in Bonbon, and General Patton is there of the French Army. Field Marshal Haig is there of the British Army. Of course, General Pershing is there for the American Expeditionary Forces. And General Foch says through an interpreter, the German army has culminated. It's time to take the fight to the enemy, go over on a counteroffensive. And to a man, all the commanders balk. No, we're not ready for that. The Americans, we need more time. The French and British are staggering from the losses of the previous few months. And Foch knows it's a hard thing. He has a copy of the plan given to each commander, says take that back to your staffs and get back to me tomorrow. They review his plan. It's going to be later called the Grand Offensive, and it's brilliant. And to a man, they all agree. It's time to take the fight to the enemy and win the war a year sooner than anyone thought it was possible. The plan was to knock the Germans out in 1919. So anyway, the big problem we have in the Western Front are the German strategic reserves. There's 24 German reserve divisions that had been rushed up and down the Western Front the previous 4 years of the war. And anytime the Allies had punched a hole in the line, the German reserve divisions would show up within 24 to 72 hours and stopgap that. General Foch, the Supreme Allied Commander, needs that strategic reserve force tied up or defeated. Either way, he needs them out of the way. And the Americans are going to be given the job of doing that. The plan is to kick off the attack on 26 September 1918 with a Franco-American attack. It's one of our largest attacks. 1.2 million Americans will serve in the Meuse Argonne region, backed up and supported and fighting alongside 600,000 Frenchmen, so almost 2 million soldiers in the Meuse Argonne region. Why is it so critical for the Germans? If you'll notice on this West Point map, there's some rail networks. There's only a few that come out of Germany, and that's the lifeline to the German army. This lifeline comes out from Strasbourg and also Koblenz, Germany, and where that star is the the French town of Meuse-Argonne, And if we sever or threaten that, it'll cut the Germans off from that supply line. And so it works according to the plan. The Americans attack. All 24 German strategic reserve divisions end up fighting the Americans there to stop us. They can't give up geography for time. Up elsewhere, where the rest of the attacks launch, so it's almost an in-echelon attack, but it's not quite. You have the Americans first, the British and French, the Belgian, French, and British, and then another French attack here. And so it overwhelms, it's a broad front attack, overwhelms the German defenses, the strategic reserves are out of the way, and forces the Germans to quit. Do you see some parallels in 1944 here? Although General Eisenhower was stuck at Camp Colt at Gettysburg on the tanks training, he didn't make it there. He did write the books we use even today, used by the American Memorial Battlefields Commission. He walked that terrain. He saw Foch's broad front strategy, and we see this echoed in his own career later on, fighting the Nazis in 44, 45. Interesting. That's where the war is going to end. So the red line is a kickoff point with the American attack on 26 September, Block 1. And of course, you see where we end, and that's the Armistice on 11 November, 11 o'clock. The Meuse Argonne offensive. There's a lot of French Renault tanks, oftentimes crewed by Americans, sometimes by French tankers. The plan is this is the Meuse Argonne sector. I'll talk about this in some detail. Here's the Argonne Forest, here's the Meuse Valley, and then we have the Meuse River that goes through Verdun. That's why it's called Meuse Argonne. The plan is to launch the attack with 3 American corps. This will be the first Army attack. And you can see it's a pretty ambitious plan there to break about 10 miles behind German lines on the first day. We don't quite achieve that, but we do have a pretty powerful knockout punch when we kick off the attack the first couple days. The only problem with this is this is actually one of the maps that Eisenhower helped make. This shows you the layer of German defensive belts in the Argonne region. Since the Germans could not give up to geography for time and space, they had to defend every corner, every ridgeline, every forest, and you could see why. Because here's the depth of the lines, and in the Argonne, to break behind German lines only 18 kilometers. Elsewhere, the French and British fight, there's a lot more depth, so there's just no space. So the Germans are going to fight every terrain feature there to the death. This is to give you a flavor for the Argonne and the Meuse Valley. So the Argonne Forest has been there since Noah's days. It's an ancient forest. The Romans did nothing with it. The French haven't done. It's just too rugged, and I'll show you some pictures of that. And then it flattens out to the Meuse Valley, which has a series of rolling hills that go from west to east. Perfect for the defense, especially since the Americans are attacking from the south. So we have to face the terrain. So we're facing not only bad weather, we're facing an enemy who uses the terrain well. We're fighting awful terrain that favors the defender. So it's a pretty rough go for the Americans, especially a green army that we are. So that's the angle coming from the south to the north. The high ground, you have the Meuse Valley here, and you have a series of very high hills on the opposite side of the Meuse River, and then, of course, the Argonne. Those dominate the entire valley. Then, of course, you have the rivers, a small river here that's still an obstacle called the Aire River, and then, of course, the Meuse River here, which is quite broad. And there's the German belts that are defending as we come from the south to the north, and it's not going to be an easy go. So how exactly do we break the Argonne? General Pershing's plan is basically to use surprise, audacity, and overwhelming force. We're going into the fight with 28,000 man-sized divisions. They're twice the size of European army divisions that our counterparts. And the plan is just smash the Germans with raw manpower. The Meuse Argonne campaign is going to basically, I break it down to these 3 phases. There's other views on this. Phase 1 is our initial attack. Phase 2 is almost all of October, where it's a slugfest. It's just vicious fighting, and we'll hit some of the highlights of each of the epics there. And then finally, the breakout on 1 November for the Americans. So 100 years ago today, we're almost in pursuit of the German army at this point, finally. The advantage of surprise really works well. The French are covering the front of the Meuse Argonne sector as the Americans filter in behind them, and it's absolutely brilliant. And these are intelligence reports that I gathered from the German 125th Württemberg Regiment out of Stuttgart, Germany. And initially, as the Americans are building up opposite of the German army, here's what the reports they're getting from their army intel sector on the German side. Initially, a thought is in September the Americans will not attack in the Meuse Argonne region. The belief is the Americans will continue the attack from Saint-Mihiel, which is 100 kilometers to the east. And then on 11 September, some German observation and listening posts hear Italian being spoken across the lines. And they think it's an Italian regiment that's up there. Well, actually, it's some of my ancestors sitting in a line and they're speaking their native tongue. And so it confuses the Germans. And then the intel analysts say the next day, well, no, the Italians are just trying to deceive us. Really, there's French troops there, and they're just speaking Italian to fool us. Okay, it's not looking so good for the intel people. And then finally, I'm an intel officer. I feel their pain. The 21st of September, we're getting close to the attack. The assessment is no, there's going to be no attack. It's French and Italians, no big deal. And meanwhile, we have more than 500,000 Americans pouring into the region. Finally, a German aviator breaks through the sector. The French put up a screen of aircraft to keep penetrations for aerial reconnaissance. And I'm going to quote what the Germans say: "This brave, dauntless German aviator broke through the enemy air screen and saw mountains of material and thousands of men, and we need help pretty quickly." And that's where you see this panic right here. There's Americans, they're coming, and there's a whole bunch of them. So we have the element of surprise. And so the attack kicks off. You see the figures there. It's pretty impressive. Initially, 100,000 French, another 100,000 will back us up through the next 6 weeks. You see a lot of tanks. There's a Lieutenant Colonel George Smith Patton out there running around on the battlefield. He commands a brigade of tanks, but he's on foot. And so he has quite an experience out there. Gets a pretty bad wound, actually, in the first day, trying to motivate the troops. And lots of artillery. One of the batteries in the 35th Division is fired by this young Captain Harry S. Truman. Anyone ever hear of Captain Harry S. Truman? An entire generation is shaped by this moment in time, by the Meuse Argonne campaign. It was just a generation ago when you said, the Argonne, it would send chills down people's spines because they knew the hardships and the suffering and the brutality of that engagement. It's too bad it's forgotten. But we have thunder in the Argonne to revive the memory. So the attack kicks off on 26 September. The Americans do a great offensive maneuver up the Meuse Valley, but in the Argonne it doesn't go so well. The Germans they're using the terrain to their advantage, and they cause a lot of casualties in the Americans initially pushing through there. But the attack is moving forward, and it's having the desired effect that General Foix, the Supreme Allied Commander, had hoped. The strategic reserves are being committed to the American sector. And for the next 6-7 weeks, they're going to pour into there to try to stop the American push. The Germans see the threat the Americans pose. If we break through to the Sedan rail network, their army is threatened with encirclement. A third of their army is anyway. So it's having a desired result. We call that a critical vulnerability from the Clausewitzian point of view. I believe the center of gravity on the Western Front was the German strategic reserve divisions that were moving back and forth. And so we can't maybe attack them directly, but we could force their commitment and get them out of the way, and that's exactly what happens next. So the blue line shows what the plan was. The thick black line shows you how far the Americans attacked on the first day. That's not that bad. This is terrain that 4 years of French, Italians, and Germans only exchange a few kilometers back and forth, 4 years of churn, and we break out of that 4 years of churn in the first day. That's quite an achievement. They give you a flavor for some of the fighting. Defending the hill of Foix. That's the hill where the French and German armies clashed in 1914. Neither side could take the hill, so they resorted to subterranean warfare, started digging 17 kilometers of tunnels and blowing each other up from underneath. The entire town on top of the hill is gone. The entire center of the hill is sliced away by 504 explosions. Defending that hill from the 35th Division, made up of men from Kansas, Missouri, is the 2nd Guards Foot Regiment. The 2nd Guards, this is the Kaiser zone. We're not facing, convalescing old men or what have you. We're facing some good troops. They're defending Foix, and that's their last message they sent before the telephone goes silent. We are being attacked from all sides by large masses of the Americans. We will fight to the last man. Long live the king. and they die in Foix in the tunnels. And there's Lieutenant Colonel George Patton. The attack is kind of well, he's sitting in headquarters waiting for messages. He's not getting any word from his tankers on what's going on, so he becomes very restless, and he goes, I'm going out to the battlefield. And he goes out with his entourage of staff officers, and he finds a lot of leaderless soldiers just kind of milling about. And so before you know it, he has 150 men with him, and they advance up a slope, and of course he starts facing German machine guns, and he rallies the tankers to press the attack and break through. He receives a wound that passes through his hip and exits his left butt cheek, and he's evacuated. That's his last day in the Meuse Argonne campaign. As an aside, General Patton's very proud of his war wound, and so when he goes to Coney Island on the beach there, he likes to cut a hole in his bathing suit to show it off. And of course, the police arrest him for indecent exposure because half his butt cheeks hanging out. But anyway, only George Patton would do that. In the Argonne Forest, we have the 2nd Württemberg Division out of southwestern Germany attacking the Americans, and they stop us. They prevent any breakthroughs in the Argonne. So this is a problem. The Americans progress up the Meuse Valley, but the Argonne on the American left flank is entirely overwatched by the Germans. The high ground there, and they're calling in artillery and just causing a mess for the Americans. That becomes a problem throughout this attack. The hill of Mount Faucon, the highest hill in the middle of the valley. Whoever controls that hill controls the entire region. That's why the American Expeditionary Forces monument's on it today. It was that critical. It was key terrain. It takes the Americans 2 days to take that hill. General Pershing had hoped to take it the first day. Leading the attack was a regiment from Baltimore commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Sweezy. Lieutenant Colonel Sweezy had a speech impediment. And as the men on the second day are pressing the attack, General Pershing is on their backs. You better get that hill today. Lieutenant Colonel Sweezy is out front leading his men. And one of the soldiers runs back, sir, we can't go any further. And Lieutenant Colonel Sweezy says, yes, you will, by God. And they do. But later on in combat, anytime the guys hit a wall of German fire, somebody is negative, or we can't go any further, they'll kind of repeat that phrase, and it becomes like a nom de guerre for the men to motivate them. The initial shock is absorbed by the Germans. Here's General Pershing's counterpart, General von Galvez. He's an artilleryman by trade, a very successful German commander, both on the Eastern Balkans and Western Front. And he's doing all he can with the strategic reserves. He's sending reports to the German command in Spa, Belgium. That's Hindenburg and Ludendorff. And they understand the threat that he's under, and they're giving him priority of fill of all the strategic support that he can provide. And he has a mix of, we call them nationalities, kingdoms. He has Prussians, Württembergers, Bavarians, and even Saxons. All the old German kingdoms are fighting for him. These are interesting stories here, because I think these sorts of things can motivate us, whether we're in the service or not. Is that it's amazing to me that people that really kind of rise to the occasion are those that are viewed oftentimes in the eyes of the world of being less likely to succeed. Thus is the case here with the Lieutenant Colonel James Rieger from Kirksville, Missouri. The war breaks out. He's an attorney. He signs up. He reports at Camp Doniphan in Texas to train up with his division. And he's a bit disturbed that the soldiers have no diversions other than getting drunk and chasing girls. Things haven't changed much. And so he starts a very popular Sunday school program. And about 300 or 400 soldiers attend every Sunday. And the acting commander is the division artillery commander. His name is General Barry. General Barry thinks this is not good for the soldiers. It's going to make them, Bishop, you're going to help me here. Christianity is going to make my men weak. So let them go out and cause trouble. And anyway, Major Rieger's like, no, I think we need to do this. And so General Barry tries to fire Rieger for not being a good, hard leader. He's too nice to his men. Okay, the Army says, no, General Barry, that's not grounds to relieve somebody. He's staying. And so General Barry, in frustration, says, you know what, Rieger, you're altogether useless. You'll never amount to anything in this Army. Okay, 26 September 1918. This hopelessly useless officer is given the mission of securing that hill, Foix, I described to you, with 17 kilometers of tunnels underneath that's been blown apart by the German and French armies. Neither side could take the hill in horrible fighting. 8,000 bodies are vaporized on that hill. I mean, it's a bad deal. Rieger, he's a battalion commander. He's told, you got to secure the west side of that hill. So he leads his men across on that morning of 26 September 1918, facing the 2nd Guards Foot Regiment. And not only does this hopelessly useless officer liberate Foix, but he goes on to liberate 2 French villages. This hopelessly useless officer never amounted to anything. It's amazing. It should give you all hope. I know it gives me hope. He's the first American in Charpentry, leading his men through there. He's one of the first Americans in Extremont. I mean, it's absolutely superb. And when his division, the 35th Division, collapses after 3 days of fighting, most of the leaders are killed. It's one of the greenest divisions in the Army. It literally collapses. He's one of only 3 battalion commanders that maintains organization and leadership of his men, and they hold the line against overwhelming odds. And of course, an engineer brigade as well. And so the French call him the hero of the Argonne. The interesting point of this whole story, though, is even more so. General Barry, what happened to him? He was relieved for cause for incompetence at the same time this is going on. So there is justice from time to time in this life. And this gives you a feel of the American Army. This is our first combined and joint operations. We'll integrate airstrikes, we'll integrate armor warfare. It's absolutely superb. And the Germans are watching over the next 7 weeks, next 47 days, the American Army develop and improve. Because I think the secret army of the secret weapon of the American Army at this time actually was so many French military advisors assigned at battalion, brigade, and division level. And these combat veterans, 4 years on the Western Front, are whispering in the ears of the junior officers on how to beat the Germans. And it's listening to these German liaison officers that the Americans are able to integrate machine guns, maneuver, infantry, armor, and airstrikes, and artillery fires. And the Germans, one of the German officers that's captured during this attack actually says, you know, when you Americans attack just with infantry, we win every time. When you attack with infantry and artillery, we win half the time. But when you attack with infantry, artillery, and tanks, you win every time. And so they're watching the Americans develop and improve throughout the campaign. Okay, the initial attack, the German reserve divisions show up, and now we're stuck in a slugfest, the meat grinder, I call it. And that's almost all of October. And there's just some incredible feats of heroism and sacrifice that come out of this period. So one of the reasons why there's so many green units in the Meuse Argonne campaign is because just 2 weeks before the Meuse Argonne campaign was the first American Army level attack called Saint-Mihiel. And General Pershing saw that since this is the first American Army level attack, it has to succeed. So he took a risk in putting Big Red 1 and Rocket de Marne and so many other combat experienced divisions out in Saint-Mihiel. So it was going to take them about a week or so to get back to the Meuse Argonne. So this is one reason why we see the 35th Division, falling apart. Green Division, and they're going to be backed up by Big Red 1. 1st Infantry is going to back them up. So for the next month, that's all the terrain that's taken, secured French territory that's liberated by the Americans. And it's an awful fight. And any progress in the Meuse Argonne region is hinged upon the heroism and actions of soldiers, not unlike James Rieger. And we're going to hit some of the highlights here. Of course, one of them will be the leadership of Major Charles Whittlesey of the Lost Battalion. And they're trapped 5 days behind the enemy lines. And of course, Alvin York, we have to talk about him. You have Doug Mastriano here. Sergeant York's my favorite movie. Could you guess that? And then, of course, Sam Woodfill. There's so many to focus in on. I discussed these 3 initially because General Pershing was asked after the war, who were the 3 greatest soldiers to come out of the American experience in the Meuse Argonne? And he said Major Charles Whittlesey, Sergeant Alvin York, and Lieutenant Sam Woodfill. Senior leader is brilliant. National Guard, National Army draftee, and regular Army. He covered all the 3 major sub-services in the United States Army by saying that. Obviously, he gave that some real thought. But okay, Lost Battalion. 2nd October 1918, the American 77th Liberty Division, Metropolitan Division, if you will, out of New York City, attacks, and about 694 men break behind German lines, and they dig in on the objective. For 5 days, they're besieged by the German army. And the German army is doing all they can to destroy what they call the Amerikaner nest, the American nest. And you can see the symbology here, how the Germans had them suppressed. For 5 days, the Americans for 4 days, the Americans are doing frontal attacks, trying to save them, and losing more men that are actually trapped. Finally, on the 4th day, somebody says, maybe we should try a flanking action. I mean, this is Tactics 101. This is why we have so many schools in the armed services today, so we don't have to think about it while you're actually in the action. So that leads into the action of Sergeant Alvin York, the flanking movement to try to save these men. It's a tough thing. Let me go back to this. The Germans bring up shock troops to try to destroy the Americans. In one case, the division commander, General Alexander, orders his artillery to put up a barrage in front of the Americans, just on top of that road, to shield them from frontal German attacks. And the barrage falls short, and 89 Americans are killed or wounded by American artillery. It's just devastating. The problem was the night before, the Germans found the telephone wire for communications to headquarters, and they cut it. So they're down to courier pigeon. In the middle of this barrage, there's 2 birds left. Private Omer Richards has the cage on his back. Major Charles Whittlesey scribbles a note. Our artillery is landing directly upon us, and he gives a location. For God's sake, stop it. And as Private Omer Richards is opening the cage, the wicker basket, a blast explodes next to him from artillery, and one of the birds gets away. Major Whittlesey like, what are you doing? We're down to 1 bird. The last bird is Cherami. Private Omer Richards grabs Cherami, puts the message on her leg, and she is released, and she's not too keen on flying in the middle of a barrage, so she lands on a nearby tree and goes to roost. Major Whittlesey, the battalion commander, is like, get that bird out of here. So Private Richards is throwing rocks and sticks and yelling, and the bird's not budging. Finally, he climbs up the tree. Cherami goes higher and higher to the top, and then to the next tree. Repeat process. Poor Private Omer Richards. Finally, he scares Cherami off. She takes off, and just as she goes, an American round explodes underneath her, killing 5 American soldiers and an explosion of feathers, and she crashes to the ground. All hope is lost. But Cherami is an army bird. After a few minutes, she comes to. And although missing a leg and missing an eye and having a hole in her breast, she makes it back to headquarters in 40-some minutes and saves the day. And you actually see her in the museum down here on the mall in the Smithsonian. So Cherami, she's going to live another year, given a citation and a small pension. There was complaints that it was only bird feed, but it was enough for her to live off of. So, sorry about that. It is true, though. Wow. And then, of course, Sergeant Alvin York. York's story is so captivating to, I think, to all Americans because of his struggle with whether a Christian can kill for his country. So he remains a model soldier in our leadership model and leadership manuals today. He's been in there since the 80s as this kind of soldier we want our troops to emulate, and rightly so. He has a rough beginning. After his dad dies, he can't handle the pressure of running the household. He becomes a party animal. He hangs out at these blind tigers on the Kentucky border, gets drunk, in trouble. The law's after him. He's in the fights all the time. A neighbor girl catches his eye. He starts going to church just to see Gracie Williams, ends up hearing the gospel, accepts the Lord. His life radically changes. He becomes a man of honor. Every day he tries to do the right thing. The funny thing is the day after he went up and accepted the Lord is a Friday. That's drinking night. And guess who came knocking on the door the next day? His drinking buddies. And Alvin York describes it as, I was getting my hat and coat and get ready to go, and I was like, oh, no, I can't do this. I accepted the Lord last night. And his friends are like, oh, Alvin, we're Christians too. He's like, no, get out of here, guys. But he says this, and this is why I think he's featured in, Marty, it's good to see you, man. Man, so many great people here. Alvin York says, it was really hard to say no because he really wanted to go downtown and that blind tigers to hang out and get drunk and fight and carry on. But he said, every time I said no to the temptation, the easier it was to resist it. He's building his character muscle. And that's the thing that's really attractive about the York story. So he becomes a man of honor and bravery and courage in his heart. So when we see the action on 8 October 1918, I believe it's merely an outward manifestation of the man that he became. And this is why we have core values in all of our armed services, is to develop within our soldiers a desire to do the right thing, to practice doing the right thing. It's like hitting the weights. Yes, you'll make mistakes, it might not work out right the first day, but you keep on trying to improve yourself, develop that character muscle. And so when that day comes that tries your soul, you'll know what to do. Alvin York faces that day on 8 October 1918. Most of us seen Hacksaw Ridge, the story about Desmond Doss in Okinawa in 1945. Now, the advantage Alvin York has is he's a big, tall, lanky mountain man, so he doesn't get physically assaulted like Desmond does. But he has a real hard time trying to wrestle through the efficacy of killing for one's country. Thankfully, his battalion and company commanders understand this plight and are talking him through that, taking the time to mentor this young soldier through. And so 8 October 1918, he literally says to the men around him, I'm going to just die for my country. I can't kill any Germans. Well, anyway, the American 82nd Division attacks to try to save the lost battalion. It's a flanking action, and it's a death trap. The Germans see the Americans coming. The key German players here are Lieutenant Paul Foer from Ulm, Germany. He's the overall commander of the area York's going to attack. We got Max Thoma from the 7th Bavarian. He's a reinforcing unit. And then we have Lieutenant Paul Lipp, the machine gun commander, the machine gun that kills so many Americans. And so Alvin York's unit, the 82nd, attacks into the Argonne Forest. They're stopped dead in their tracks. All hope is lost. York and 16 others break through the German lines, meander their way behind the Germans, surprise about 70 Germans behind the lines, capture them, trying to push them into a manageable group. German machine gun on the hill above sees the plight of the fellow Germans down below, yells Runter, Lieutenant Lipp yells get down. The Germans hit the deck. All 17 Americans are standing in the open. Machine gun opens fire, killing 6, wounding 3. York is the only non-commissioned officer left, not dead or wounded, with 7 Americans and 70 prisoners hugging the ground. And in that instant, York knows what to do. It becomes very clear to him when he looks over to his side, where his only friend in the Army, Corporal Murray Savage, was moments before, and he was among the first hit, and his body was so shattered that it was in pieces on the ground that he's going to be buried on the spot after the battle. He's just too bad to move. York says, I got to stop the killing. And it wasn't rage, and I'll explain why I know this. He charges up the hill, outflanks the German machine gun, and starts shooting at Germans, 19 Germans in the machine gun position and supporting infantry. In between shots, he's yelling for them to surrender. That's why I say it's not rage. Okay, that's enough, surrender, I'm not kill anymore. And then, he kills all 19, runs back down the hill, chased by a German bayonet attack, pulls out his Colt 45 pistol, starts shooting the Germans from back to front. And it's so devastating that it results in the surrender of 132 Germans. The devastation actually goes back to Lieutenant Paul Foer. Leading that bayonet attack against Alvin York is Lieutenant Fritz Endres, Paul Foer's Army buddy, 10 years ago in the United States. I'm sorry, not that. The German Army, the German Imperial Army, 120th Württemberg. Fritz Endres is shot in the abs, and he's begging for help on the ground there. And Paul Foer is trying to save the life of his friend. And he walks over to Alvin York, who's now shooting at the reinforcing Germans on the hill above. English. You speak English? English? York's like, no, I'm American. Paul Foer says, if you stop shooting, I'll make them surrender. And Foer blows on a whistle, and it results in the capture of 132 Germans. Somebody who was once told he'd never amount to anything in life. You're good-for-nothing drunk Alvin York. You only have a third-grade education. You're dumb. And he changed the course of history. So I wonder what you can do in life. Never give up hope. You can change history. Or maybe you'll be like York's battalion and company commanders and help someone through who's going to be the next Alvin York to change history. And then, of course, Sam Woodfill. Sam Woodfill is with the 5th Infantry Division, and his men are doing what I call really a reconnaissance and force. It's really not a major attack towards the village of Canal. The Meuse Argonne American Cemetery today is right here, largest American cemetery in Europe, 14,246. It's an important part. The reason why the cemetery is there, this is part of the German last line of defense, the last prepared line of defense. We break through that, we're in open warfare, finally, but it's going to take us a while to get there. Sam Woodfill leads his men forward, and he and his men, his company, are stopped right here with heavy German machine gun fires. He knows there's a sniper in a church, picks it off. A sniper in a barn kills him, and then charges forward and wipes out a German machine gun position. You can see he charges up the hill. His men join him, takes out several more German machine gun positions. The last German machine gun he takes out, his Colt 45 pistol jams. He looks around. There's Germans there about to shoot him. He grabs a German pick out of the foxhole the Germans were in and kills the Germans with the pick. And so for these 3 actions here I described are Medal of Honor recipients. Just incredible tenacity. This gives you more of a flavor of the churn of October for the Americans. He was at this time Brigadier General Douglas MacArthur is advancing with his brigade towards the German Kriemhildestellung, the last German line that I mentioned that Sam Woodfill is also attacking. And 2 attacks, MacArthur's men are stopped. The Corps commander comes down, General Summerall, and he says to Doug MacArthur, give me Châtillon, that key terrain, that big hill. Give me Châtillon or a list of 5,000 casualties. And Doug MacArthur, in his typical bravado, replies, my name will be at the head of that list of 5,000. Okay, fantastic. General MacArthur summons a meeting for all of his leaders. Okay, guys, we really got to take the hill this time. One of the officers says, well, how are we going to do it, boss? We're going to go frontal attack just like the last 2 times. And there's a young captain, Captain Ravi Norris, says, I've been on that hill for 2 days. Aren't you going to ask me my opinion? Ravi Norris, he's awesome. Because at that moment, he describes in vivid detail, because I thought at that time I was going to be fired or court-martialed because I was speaking out of term. And MacArthur and the other officers like, well, you got a better idea? You got to credit Doug MacArthur for asking his captain, basically, and his boss, Lieutenant Colonel Bear, what do you think? And Captain Ravi Norris says, I will lead 100 men around the flank. You guys do your frontal attack. The Germans are expecting it, because this will be the 3rd time you did that. And as you draw them off, we'll break through the German lines. And sure enough, it works like a charm. So imagine how history could have been changed had not Ravi Norris spoken up. Doug MacArthur wouldn't have been there for what he did in the Pacific Campaign or Korea. It's just interesting how oftentimes people's lives are changed by somebody they work for and their willingness to listen to junior officers and junior enlisted. The line is broken. So, Captain Harris. I'm kind of tempted to ask Harriet and Ted, but anyway, General Stroop and Harriet. This is one of their relatives. This is Harriet's cousin, and they were just in France on the 20th, commemorating the day he lost his life. Captain Harris was the youngest captain in the United States Army at the time. His dad was the adjutant general, yes. And he just graduated from West Point, was assigned to the 3rd Infantry Division with the 6 engineers. The 3rd Infantry rocket Marne is ordered to clear the Germans from the Chêne woods, not too far from Ankerville, and they're stopped by the Germans, the infantry. And so Captain Harris tells his men to drop all their engineer implements and to support the infantry troops, and he leads his men in a maneuver that drives the Germans out of the wood and captures 3 German prisoners, but more importantly, 2 German machine guns. They did not realize that the rest of the divisions didn't come up on their flank. So they're on their own there. The Germans launch a counterattack. Captain Harris takes the machine guns and puts them out on an open field for better fields of fire and causes a lot of German casualties, delays the German counterattack. But in the end, the Germans are going to wound him with a wound to his lung, and he's going to die in German hands. But this Distinguished Service Cross recipient, this is just one of thousands of similar stories of heroism and sacrifice to try to break the German lines and overcome our training deficit as well. And it fell on the shoulders of young men like this. It's kind of tragic. Finally, 1 November, we're going to have our next and last major push. It's going to kick off here on 1 November. All the lessons learned of the previous month and a half will be applied, and the Americans will break the German lines. It's absolutely superb how quick the United States Army learned in contact and open warfare at last. Leading the attack here is Sergeant Portal with his cat Mustard, and this is true. And this time, 100 years ago, Sergeant Portal and Mustard the cat are in that Renault tank driving the Germans back. Combined warfare. I'm going to hit some highlights here. 89th Division. We have several Medal of Honor recipients for the first couple days of action. Sergeant Forrest is an interesting story. His company attacks, and they're under heavy German machine gun fires. Just the Germans start open fire. Everyone hits the deck. Sergeant Forrest says, I was so terrified that I ran. And his company commander says, yeah, he ran right towards the enemy. And he's going to clear several German machine gun positions and capture about a dozen Germans as well. I mean, it's outstanding. So we even have a private Forrest, a Sergeant Forrest in World War I, kind of like in Vietnam with, never mind, Forrest Gump, different Forrest. Senior leaders, be careful thinking out loud. General Pershing kind of muses to his G3. It would be nice if the 1st Infantry Division liberates Sedan, achieves the Army objective. The only problem is Sedan is off the map that way, and Big Red 1 is way over here, and we're pressing the attack this way towards the Meuse River. And so the Corps commander goes, General Summerall says, hey, I got word from General Pershing. He wants Big Red 1 to have the honor of liberating Sedan. And what's that? It's a bad idea. General Parker's like, okay, boss, I got your orders, I'll figure it out. And so General Summerall leaves, the Corps commander thinking they're going to do a river assault operation and go that way. No, General Parker says, no, it'd be better if we cut across 1st Corps sector here. That's not a good idea. And so, Big Red One does more damage to the American Army attack by stopping the entire corps advance by traversing across the American lines. About 167 Americans are killed in friendly fire. Nothing's coordinated. The Big Red One launches. The regimental commander leading the way is Teddy Roosevelt Jr. He has his orders, and his men are booking it. Men are literally falling asleep on the march. And right before Big Red One's about to seize the objective, Sedan, the French 4th Army commander's like, that's our city. Get out of our sector. We're going to open fire on you. And the French are calling up General Pershing. What are Americans doing in 4th Army sector? And so right before seizing the objective, Teddy Roosevelt is called off. And he has to surprise his wife, who's been a volunteer with YMC, happens to be in the area. It was Providence. And so they're able to have a reunion there even after this debacle anyway. And there's actually a news crew there filming them seeing each other for the first time in some months, which is kind of really neat. The French are very, very kind about this whole thing here. The French basically say, well, since you guys are so eager to liberate Sedan, both a French and American unit will liberate the city. And you see the combined French and American units there seizing Sedan, finally. It's very symbolic. And some final moments here. Around 5 o'clock in the morning on 11 November, the Germans and the French and the rest of the Allies come to an agreement on an armistice. So it's not an end to the war, it's a stop, basically, an armistice. Word gets out to most American units between 8 and 9 o'clock in the morning. The orders from on high are to continue the attack. And this is why we have so many casualties the last few hours of the war. The Germans are given orders to hold the line until 11 o'clock. And actually, their orders are to stop shooting around 10:55 if possible. So the Germans, they say, so we can't be accused of violating the ceasefire. And so I want you to pay attention in particular to Private Guenther here with the 79th Division out of Baltimore and 5th Division's at Lupi under Colonel Peck. I'll tell a couple stories and then wrap it up. So 5th Infantry Division, they seize under 11th Regiment under Colonel Peck, they seize the village of Lupi at high cost on the morning of 11 November. The war's ending in a few hours. It ends at 11 o'clock. And Colonel Peck decides he's going to continue the attack up the steep hill to drive the Germans back. He's forming his men up for an attack. At the same time, the division commander sends down Lieutenant Lukert right here, says, stop Colonel Peck from attacking. I know he has plans. I don't want any more American losses of life. Lieutenant Lukert finds Colonel Peck in the steeple of the church in Lupi with binoculars getting ready to launch an attack at 10:30. Lieutenant Lukert says, hey, boss, division commander says, stop attacking. And Colonel Peck says, no, I'm attacking until 11 o'clock. And Lieutenant Lukert says in his memoirs, it was very frustrating. I didn't know what to do. I was beside myself. As the Americans are forming up to attack, just moments before the war is about to end, with 30 minutes or less before the war is ending, a German officer starts walking down the hill with a white flag. And this is what he says. He says to Colonel Peck, because I need to see the commanding officer, in perfect English. Colonel Peck shows up, and he's staring at the German officer, and the German officer says, my division is 4 miles away, but I am ordered to cover that retreat and permit the removal of our material. This I must do and will. I know you will attack in a few minutes. One grand finish, so to speak, and I am prepared to meet you on that crest. And then Lieutenant Lukert is listening to this whole conversation, and he says the German officer claims they have 65 machine guns on the ridge above about to open fire on the Americans. And the German officer completes by saying, the machine guns are laid and waiting to stop your advance up that hill. Will you come and cause more casualties? Since the soldiers in the regiment heard this conversation, Colonel Peck couldn't order them forward, and Lukert was relieved. The ceasefire comes into effect at 11 o'clock, and Lukert waves down the officer, and sure enough, he counts 65 machine gun positions dug in. So that's amazing to me, the enemy is willing to stop combat when they could have wiped out an entire regiment of men effectively. Attack until the end, the 79th Division. We have Private Henry Guenther, and he's believed to be the last American to fall. He falls at 10:59. His unit advance is stopped by German machine guns. At 10:59, he gets up to single-handedly wipe out the German machine gun, and he's hit. And the eyewitnesses describe with some poetry that as his body falls, there's silence. His last burst of fire, and there's silence, and thud, you could hear him hit the ground. It was like an eerie silence, they describe. And that's the price of this type of war. The last 11 hours, I mean, it's really tough. The 2nd Infantry Division, 1/3 Marine, 2/3 Army. The Marine Brigade was ordered to do a river assault crossing operation the last day of the war. And the Marines, with the support of the 89th Army Division, they break across the Meuse Valley under heavy fire. The Meuse River is both a wide river and a canal, and they have to assault across both of these obstacles. The river is flooded by almost rain every day. And so hundreds of men are falling casualty. The messengers the couriers that are sent over to tell everybody that the war ends at 11 o'clock, the Marines never get the word because the messengers are being killed as they come across. Finally, around 10:55, as the Marines and the soldiers are attacking up the crest of the Meuse hill, the heights on the other side of the Meuse River, they notice the German fire becomes inaccurate. The Germans are starting to shoot around the Americans to slow them down, but not to kill them. Finally, a runner's able to get across the bridge, say, the war's over, stop. And then they're like, oh yeah, I wondered why the Germans stopped slaughtering us. Yeah, it's quite a mess. 11 o'clock in the morning, 11,000 casualties across the Allied line, 3,500 being American in the last few hours of the war. It's a great price, but there's a lot of stories here that echoes across the generations. The United States Army, how we fight today goes back in many ways in 1918. Our experience with armor warfare, we cut our teeth there with Lieutenant Colonel Patton and so many others. Integration of aviation, artillery fires, and joint and combined effects comes out of all this. But more importantly, the legacy of those who fought in this war. And the stories like Rieger and York and Whittlesey and Woodville, Harris, it tells me that your life matters, and what you do in life echoes across the generations into eternity. You just might change the course of history or might influence the next person who does. Never give up hope, because we're standing on the shoulders of giants, and now it's our turn to carry that torch. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions. I see some microphones out there. Any questions? Yes, sir. Let a mic come to you. Thank you.
Could you talk a little bit about the high command, like especially General Hunter Liggett, and how some people think that he was actually a much better tactical and operational commander than, in fact, Pershing was?
Yeah. Hunter Liggett is going to be asked by Pershing to take over the Army, actually become the first Army commander in mid-October. And Hunter Liggett asked for a few days reprieve to get his arms around the situation. He goes from first Corps commander to Army commander on the 15th of October. Pershing had his hands full. Pershing was trying to handle all the strategic issues with General Foix and with George Clemenceau, the French premier. That Clemenceau despised Pershing because Pershing never really took the time to talk at the strategic level and also coordinate with the French Army, Patton, as well as the British Army, Field Marshal Haig. And so instead, Pershing fell to the fatal flaw of going where he was comfortable. He rose through the ranks, as most of us do, and he was comfortable at the lower levels of operations and tactics, and got hung up in there as the AEF commander. He allowed himself get drugged down to the tactical and operational issues way too much, and I believe he did a great disservice by not handling the strategic issues. Okay, General Hunter Liggett, he's asked by Pershing. Pershing finally realizes he can't do it all. He needs an Army commander there handling First Army, and also we'll have a Second Army standing up shortly thereafter. And Hunter Liggett says, okay, boss, I'll do this, but let me make all the operational, tactical decisions for my Army. Yes, I'll keep you informed. I'll take your advice, but stand aside. And Pershing, to his credit, does. He gives Hunter Liggett the time and space to operate without too much interference. So that's the danger. I remember my third tour in Afghanistan, my boss was from a different nation, and he was very used to the tactics. He was an armor guy, and right away he was always involved with the tactical. And I'm like, boss, we're here in Kabul, we're dealing with strategic operational level war, and there's just a natural attraction to go where you're comfortable, I think. Something to guard against. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Microphone, please. I don't need much. What are you working on next, and how are you doing your research?
Okay, what are you working on next, and how are you doing your research?
Okay. The next book I'm co-editing together with Major General Zabecki, probably one of the Army's premier historians. It's called Pershing's Lieutenants. It's going to be an edited work. We have contributors from across academia and the armed service that are going to talk about the senior leaders working for Pershing and also the next generational leaders. So the next generation will recognize Truman, Patton, Colonel Marshall, some of these might ring a bell, MacArthur, and how this shaped our Army today. But more importantly, we'll focus on the leadership traits of Pershing and what went right and what went maybe not so well. The research is spanning both sides of the Atlantic. It's going to include a lot of resources from the German side of the story, but also, of course, heavily from Army Historic Center in Carlisle and National Archives here in College Park. I see a question back there.
Hey, thank you very much for all your talk on this. I was wondering, it seems like Pershing relieved a number of commanders, a number of people, and switched leadership around. Can you talk to how that worked and what that meant?
Yeah. This is a hard one. This might be a bit controversial here, but I'm going to give you my view on it anyway. Pershing hung a lot on, I think he put too much on the leaders. That might sound a bit weird. He expected results that were almost impossible to achieve at the division and brigade and even regimental level. And if you didn't produce results, despite what the circumstances were, the situation, the enemy, you got canned. And there's one case where he sacked General Edwards. It was very controversial. Sometimes people believe that some of the sacking was personal dislike and personal animus, or somebody that looked good in a uniform. And we're talking about now, this is a big deal. For instance, 82nd Division is commanded by General Burnham in Saint Mihiel offensive. 82nd Division now is transitioning over to the Meuse Argonne sector, and they did quite well in Saint Mihiel, and General Burnham's been leading them for a year and a half, and then suddenly Burnham is told, as we're preparing for the action in the Meuse Argonne region, is you're fired, and I'm replacing you with General Duncan, a personal friend of General Pershing. And there's a lot of perception issues here that you have to be a friend. If you're a successful officer in Big Red 1, Pershing's favorite division, you're good to go. And there's a lot of evidence of that. And second off, you got to... Big Red 1 is the most combat experienced, best division we have in the Meuse Argonne, no doubt about it, and because they're there from the beginning, and that's why Pershing has such a proclivity to love them. But on top of all that, if you don't produce results, there's a lot of turbulence. And so in the middle of a campaign, brigade commanders or division commanders are being fired, and that has the effect of just further delaying the action because new leaders come in. In one case, one of the regimental commanders come in, he can't even find his unit. He shows up 24, 36 hours late, and that delays all the action of that unit. It's stymied, it's frozen. There's so much friction created by the sacking of leaders. I think there could have been more. It's almost, I see this as sometimes as an act of desperation, trying to force results. But what I see in my research, instead, it caused a lot of paralysis. Soldiers are afraid, officers are afraid to take the initiative because if they do something Pershing that they perceives as not being right or results in failure, they'll be sacked, and there's no room for error. And so this explains why, in large part, with the 77th Division trying to save the lost battalion, it's incessant 4 days of frontal attacks before finally someone says, let's try a flanking action. And as I mentioned before, and that's why I slipped it in there, more men are lost in the relief of the lost battalion than the actual men that were trapped in the pocket. And that's all because we got to do this before the boss, General Alexander thought he's going to be fired. So instead, the division commander, 77th Division, he's deflecting all the failures down to one of the brigade commanders. And that brigade commander is deflecting down to the regimental commander. And it just creates a very hostile environment. That's my view anyway. Any other questions? I have a question here.
I'd like to know more about two aspects. The weather, what duress was going on weather-wise, and also about the background, supplies and, ordnance and dealing with wounded and food and stuff like that. So
Okay.
Did you do a lot of research about those
Yes.
Topics?
Absolutely.
Okay.
The weather, aside from the first few days and of the Meuse Argonne campaign, it rained almost every day. It was awful. The environment was terrible. So the Americans were facing the weather, the enemy, and the terrain. Everything conspired against us. So we kick off the attack in 26 September. Our soldiers break through that 4 years of churn, that moon landscape. And now how do you bring supplies up and artillery up across that terrain that's just choppy? Lacroix Hill, you can't go over that. The few roads are cratered by the Germans. And so there's always this delay of support and supplies getting up to the Americans. To make matters worse, to evacuate the soldiers, the wounded, It's a problem because you're evacuating down the Meuse Valley and a few roads we have. The Germans have the high ground in the Argonne, and they're picking off all the ambulances. To make matters worse, these narrow roads under German fire, you have artillery, supplies trying to go forward. You have a wounded trying to come down. It's pure chaos. You have the military police out there trying to bring order to this in pure darkness, and it's a catastrophe. In October, many of the divisions are stuck in this churn I talk about, this slugfest for a month. It's so bad that it almost reverts to trench warfare-like conditions. And the severity of that is, on top of that, the Spanish flu is breaking out across the armies now. And this is a great catastrophe. We don't even know how many. The numbers range from 20 million to 100 million. Man, you probably know better than I do on this. It's just a global catastrophe. It's a plague. And so the units have to be rotated in out of lines. The showers are brought up in October for some of the units so the men can clean up, get the lice off them, put on new socks because you have trench foot now. I mean, it's just all kinds of rot and the body's falling apart. People are sick. And then on top of all this, you have the effects of poisonous gas. Everyone's respiratory systems are attrited from breathing in mustard gas and other types of gas as well. All sides are using them, and it's a rough go. Pershing, to his credit, he gives a lot of forethought on what they're going to need to supply this massive American army. Of the 4 million men recruited, 2.1 million will make it to Europe, and he has the forethought to order thousands of American locomotives and tracks to be laid, and they basically clean out most of the train unions and what have you in the States. If civilians go over there, not unlike what you see in the battlefield today, and the civilians are running things behind the scenes. But the problem is 28,000-man divisions fighting in a 12,000-man sector, and the jam behind the lines is incredible. Colonel Billy Mitchell, one of the leading thinkers for American aviation, he sees firsthand, and some of his aviator pilots like Eddie Rickenbacker see the cluster behind the lines. George Clemenceau, the French premier, I think it's his 70th birthday, and the liberation of Montfaucon had just happened. And so it's September. He wants to be one of the first Frenchmen on top of that hill, and he gets stuck in his American logjam. And he gets out of the car, and he's cussing and throwing things. He's so frustrated, and right then he's like, he tells General Foch you need to fire Pershing because his army is in disarray. And of course, General Foch is like, no, he's a national commander. I can't do that. But there's a lot of Foch's leadership style reminds me of Eisenhower 44 and 45, not just in plans and concepts, but how he dealt with the national leaders. You think about Eisenhower after dealing with Montgomery and the egos between Montgomery and Patton and others, and you see General Foch weighing that as well. He staves off his French premier by protecting his subordinates, the British and the American commanders and the French commanders as well. I mean, it's absolutely brilliant. But it's a mess on the logistical side behind the lines. And medically, it's even worse. One more question.
Sir, you mentioned how Eisenhower spent some time on the front lines and also how the American Army learned how to fight this kind of war at great cost. Can you explain any more how after the war they captured those lessons learned and fixed the doctrine and prepared for the later wars in the 1940s?
Yeah, so Eisenhower always regretted that he was stuck at Camp Colt, Gettysburg, but in the 20s, he was given a job to work together with Pershing to kind of capture the experience of the Americans on the ground. And his job was to put together it's a sort of a Michelin guide of the battlefield, and with sketches on the battlefield. I mean, it's very useful when you go to the Meuse Argonne. And there he sees firsthand everything he read about. How the armed services actually capture this is, first off, the journals, the branch journals really put their arms around these lessons learned. You go to the artillery journals and the engineer journal, infantry journal, a lot of serious thought and scholarship at the junior level officer, lieutenants through majors. You'll see a lot of good articles there that really start shaping the thinking for the Second World War. At the second level, how these lessons learned are brought forward are really by people such as Lieutenant Colonel Patton and Colonel Marshall. Of course, these are going to play mass, and MacArthur as well. They're going to bring these lessons learned with him because they were there and saw it. Last question, sir.
You talked about the tremendous casualties and the fact that the American Army was developing operational art, doctrine on the fly. Did you see any indication of how they handle declaring units combat ineffective? For example, in World War II, the German regiment might have 100 men left. It was still considered a regiment. Never voted the flag.
Yeah, so the question really dealt with at what point was the unit combat ineffective from the American perspective. And sir, you're absolutely right. German units, by the end of the war, a few hundred men to make up a regiment, a couple thousand men maybe, a division, if that. It's a severe toll on the men on both sides. On the American side, I guess the added blessing was our real involvement in World War I is really from April 1918 to November. I mean, yeah, we had some minor actions, but the serious commitment of troops was just a 6 or 7 month period. So how do I identify when a unit was combat effective? There was nothing in place. The assumption was we had these massive 28,000 man divisions, and Pershing's assessment was, yes, we'll lose lots of men, but my divisions are so big we can absorb those losses and press the attack. And the only case where a unit was identified as being in trouble is the 35th Division. And I mentioned on the first couple of days they attacked, the Green Division, most of the officers are out front, many of the officers are killed early on, chaos ensues, and combat ineffective when straggles and gaggles of men are just pouring behind the lines being pursued by the Germans. And at that point, General Pershing's like, we got a problem here. And so thankfully, the 10th Engineer Brigade is the last really total unit ready to fight action in the 35th. They roll forward there with Major Rieger's men and a couple other battalion commanders, and they bring order to the chaos. What's interesting to me, and Bishop Buckham, you'll like this, in one of the regiments in the 35th Division, it was commanded by Colonel Delaplane, and Colonel Delaplane was said to be no friend of chaplains. Maybe you had an experience like this. I hope not. Anyway, now Colonel Delaplane, he just had an antipathy towards his chaplains. His regiment breaks as part of the 35th collapses, and Colonel Delaplane is shocked to see that manning the new line are his 4 regimental chaplains, and the chaplains have just taken command. They stopped, private, you are now a captain in this division, take charge of these men. You're a lieutenant over there. And Colonel Delaplane says, I thought I had 4 chaplains, but I found out I have 4 officers, you know, and leaders. And so, wow. But it was a very confusing thing to the United States Army, and we had a long way to go still, even after this war. Thank you for your time, sir. Thanks for hosting me. Cool. Thanks, sir.
Well, thanks, Doug. Thanks for an enthralling conversation. It's a great book. It is for sale, and I think if you'll be available to
Yes,
sign
sir.
for guests throughout this. So I take to heart this criticism of the 1st Infantry Division. I don't know where that comes from. It seems entirely uncalled for. So in addition to Thunder in the Argonne, Doug's book, Sergeant York, I would highly commend to you. For the cavalry officers, there's a graphic novel. It's about 12 pages for the cavalrymen, but it's worth studying. I think Doug, the point that you made, I think, rings true with me, and that is that sometimes in this army that we love, things don't change all that much. You talked about General Pershing's comments about making sure that you recognize a soldier from the National Guard, from the National Army, and from the regular Army. Some of those challenges are still with us. Steve Austin and others recognize that we still grapple with those kinds of things. I found one other thing that didn't change in the book that I would share with you and commend to you. And it's a story about yet another Medal of Honor recipient. And it's a story of Nels Wold. And I'll just read to you from the book. As they advanced, a German machine gun opened fire from the underbrush of a copse of trees. Lieutenant Wingate led his men in a charge against the Germans, killing the crew and capturing the gun. They continued to advance and cleared several German dugouts and machine guns. As Wingate's men approached the town, a German position that was impossible to charge without great loss of life opened fire on the men. One of the men, Private Nels Wold, volunteered to take out the German machine gun. Wingate, the lieutenant, gave the okay, and Nels Wold disappeared into the thicket, killed 2 of the German machine gunners, and captured 3. After he cleared the machine gun nest near that town, Lieutenant Wingate led men further into enemy lines. As the Americans advanced, another German machine gun opened fire on the men. Private Nels Wold again volunteered to attack the enemy position. Again, he succeeded, killing or capturing its occupants. Lieutenant Wingate and the other men were amazed by the selfless determination of this North Dakota farmer. Nels volunteered over and over to risk his life in attacking enemy machine gun positions, holding up the advance. and on 4 different occasions on that late morning of 26 September 1918, Private Wool demonstrated uncommon valor by single-handedly attacking German machine guns holding up the advance. He was killed in the last of those attacks, but I would tell you, in my view, the most remarkable citation from that event is not his Medal of Honor citation, though that is quite incredible. It is instead a letter that one of his fellow soldiers wrote to his mother. My dear Mrs. Wold, I am sure the death of your dear son Nels was a shock to you all. I am sure you must feel very badly. However, you are not alone, for all his pals in the Army miss him and feel the loss of a friend and true comrade. I was with Nels when he died, and his last words were of you and his loved ones. He requested that I write you and say that he truly loved you all and was ready to go. While we all miss him, we must not grieve, for he died a noble cause. It was the Lord's will that he be taken out of this world of sorrow and into the heavenly realms above. In this hour of your sorrow, I send you my sympathy and a wish that your future days may be bright and happy ones. That's one soldier about another soldier to that soldier's family. That too doesn't change over time, and something for us all to remember. Thank you, Doug, for bringing that home to us. Thank you for joining us this evening. Thank all of you so much for a wonderful evening.